Lord Joel Joffe from Lydington near Swindon was Mandela's lawyer during the infamous treason trial in 1960s. He's been sharing his moments of Nelson Mandela before, during and since the trial with BBC's Dan O'Brien.
Apartheid South Africa in 1963, the trial that would keep Nelson Mandela in prison for 27 years.
A remarkable demonstration by a crowd of several hundred outside the courthouse in Pretoria. Nelson Mandela was accused with the others of plotting sabotage to overthrow the South African government by force.
This is Mandela's story told by his defence attorney, whose legal team is credited with ensuring each of the accused escaped the expected death sentence. Having left his native South Africa, Lord Joel Joffe has lived in Wiltshire since the 1970s. Now he shares his memories of his time with Nelson Mandela during one of the most famous trials of the last century.
The courage, the demeanour, the fearlessness.
I have cherished the idea of a democratic and free society.
Everything about it was injected unforgettably into one's memory, because it is a rare occasion to have the privilege of watching such a unique human being fighting for his people.
It is an ideal for which I am prepared to die.
But we won't just hear what did happen, we'll also hear a unique account of what could have happened as Mandela awaited the death penalty.
These were the notes he'd prepared, which fortunately he never had to use. And he says, I meant everything I said. If I must die, let me declare for all to know that I will meet my fate like a man. There was no apologies.
In this special programme, exclusive to BBC Wiltshire, Lord Joel Joffe from Lydington shares his memories of Nelson Mandela. On the 11th of July 1963, the South African police raided a small farm in Rivonia, a suburb of Johannesburg. They arrested the leaders of the ANC, the African National Congress, who after years of peaceful protest had turned to violent means to bring about an end to apartheid. This, the song used as their anthem. Nelson Mandela was already serving a prison sentence, but based on the evidence found at the farm, he was put in the dock again alongside 8 others in what became known as the Rivonia trial. The families of the accused did their best to find a team of lawyers prepared to defend these men. One of the few who said yes was Joel, now Lord Joffe.
I said yes because when people need justice, it's my job as a lawyer to do what I can to try to help them.
He describes the very first meeting with the most famous of his new clients.
First time I met Nelson Mandela was in the interview room in Pretoria prison, and I, together with the 3 other lawyers who were representing Mandela, were taking statements from the other accused. Nelson Mandela at the time had been incarcerated at Robben Island for a previous offence, and so he was flown down from Cape Town to the Pretoria jail. He was ushered through the door by the prison warders into our interview room. And it was a day one would remember, because being a black prisoner already serving his sentence, he was dressed as black prisoners in South Africa were, in a way designed to humiliate them. And so he walked in there in short trousers with a sort of tattered open-necked shirt and sandals, which looked pretty worn out, and walked into this room with all of us in our suits, or the other awaiting trial prisoners in their civil garb. And he simply took command. There was no embarrassment, nothing at all. He was the leader, come to head up his supporters and to instruct the lawyers what he wanted for the trial in which he was on trial for his life. He's got a natural air of leadership, but he does not pretend or put on any airs. Quite relaxed, good-humoured, and he is a person who listens. He doesn't make decisions without referring to his co-accused. He's totally natural. And alongside his remarkable leadership and his charisma, he is actually warm and friendly to everyone. Mandela treats everybody, however important or unimportant, as equals, and is concerned about them and caring about them, but resolute in his determination to fight for whatever he believes in.
That first meeting, that first impression, had that reassured you about your decision to represent him and his friends and colleagues?
I actually never needed reassurance. These were all outstanding, wonderful men of great courage and integrity. And if you could represent them, help them in any way, it was actually a privilege rather than a burden.
The trial was to take place in the Palace of Justice in Pretoria, the South African equivalent of the High Court. The scenes outside throughout the trial demonstrated both the strength of the support of Mandela's cause and the determination of the white authorities to destroy it.
Well, there's a square in front of it, a large square, and the square was packed with black people who'd come from all over the South Africa and had fought their way through police cordons to get outside the court. Between the supporters of the African National Congress and the court were rows and rows of policemen with snarling police dogs threatening the crowd, and all armed with these sort of submachine guns.
Having forced their way through the crowds, the legal team took up their seats in the courtroom, which was no exception to the rules of segregation.
As usual in South Africa, half the court was set aside for white spectators and rather less than half for black spectators. The judge comes into court, and then the prisoners are led up from the cells underneath the court. Led by Mandela, they then take their places in the dock, and the trial begins in an air of a frightening and intimidating display of white supremacy.
Despite the setting Lord Joffe describes, the defendants took their one opportunity to speak to make a stand against authority.
The registrar of the court reads out the charge and says, "Accused number 1, Nelson Mandela, how do you plead to the charge against you?" And Mandela the response says, "I plead not guilty. It is the government which should be on trial and not me." And accused number 2, Walter Sisulu, "How do you plead?" And he says, "The government is guilty. I plead not guilty."
From what you had seen of him, was that any sense of bravado? Was that him masking his own nervousness, or was he absolutely self-assured in what he was doing?
Nelson Mandela is always self-assured. It wasn't said in a way with bravado. The government should be at trial. It was a carefully considered statement. You asked me to plead. I'm pleading not guilty. And the wrong accused is standing in the dock. It should be the government, not me. And this was the strain throughout the trial. The accused standing up and actually dominating the prosecution.
And remarkable courage to do that in that kind of setting.
Enormous courage, because you're there with the full panoply of the law, facing a death sentence, and knowing that the way you plead is actually almost an invitation to be found guilty, because their instructions were that any evidence against them which was true, we were not allowed to cross-examine. Mandela said, "If they are telling the truth, we do not deny it. This is what we did in order to achieve our freedom, and you are not allowed to cross-examine them."
How did you feel at that point?
Well, throughout the trial, we felt very nervous indeed. Nelson Mandela and the other accused, whom the more you saw of them, the more you admired their integrity, their courage, and everything about them. And so we were tremendously concerned throughout the trial that these extraordinary people could end up by being hanged
The trial continued toward the day that made the rest of the world sit up and listen, the day Nelson Mandela gave evidence and what is widely regarded as one of the most remarkable speeches of his life.
Bram Fisher, the barrister, said, I call my first witness, accused number 1, who was going to make a statement from the dock. The prosecutor, who was the nastiest and most unpleasant man I've almost ever met, stood up and said, but he shouldn't make a statement from the dock. I want him to give evidence so that I can cross-examine him. The judge then pointed out to the prosecutor that he should leave it to the defence to decide how they're going to give evidence, and it wasn't for him to make that, to give any advice. So Mandela stands up in the dock. He's always been very proud of the way he dresses. He was very well turned out, and he stands up in the dock, and he's a very striking man. He's over 6 foot, quite burly. He used to be a heavyweight boxer in his youth, and very imposing. In a calm, measured way, he starts his talk, beginning with the days when he grew up, where his father was a chief in the rural Transkei, and tracing his history back to when he moved to Johannesburg and became involved with the African National Congress. And then eventually, when the African National Congress, after 50 years of non-violent protest, decided they had no alternative other than to resort to violence, Mandela was the leader, and he went underground. He had spoken in a slow, measured way for 2.5 hours. And then he turned and he said, during my lifetime, I've dedicated myself to the struggle of the African people.
I have cherished the idea of a democratic and free society in which all persons will live together in harmony
and with equal opportunities. And then he paused, and I think he had his reading glasses on, and he took them off. He looked the judge straight in the eyes and said, but if needs be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die. And then he sat down, and there was a total silence in the court. Everybody was just overcome. And then I think a woman started sobbing, and the court came to life again. Then Bram Fisher, the chief barrister, the main barrister, stood up and said, my lord, I call my next witness. To have experienced it, to have helped to defend Nelson Mandela and his other co-accused who were equally courageous, it was a real privilege. And their courage and fearlessness and commitment to their people, their total integrity, was an inspiration.
Inspirational and remarkable. But was there a little part of you that, as his lawyer who is trying your utmost to avoid the death penalty, when the person you are defending is standing up and making it so clear that they're prepared to die for what they've done, was there a little bit of you that was just frustrated or just apprehensive of the fact that this is what he was saying? It's very inspirational, but not necessarily helping your cause as his lawyer.
That is correct. It reminds me of what actually happened, which is a very interesting story. Mandela had prepared his speech, written it out, gave it to us to read. We saw the end bit, which is, I'm prepared to die. And our barristers put it rather well. He said, you mustn't put that in, you mustn't include that in your speech. It is an invitation to the judge to hang you, and he might take you up. And really, you please take it out. So he says no, he won't. And in due course, I then handed the speech and had to get it typed out for the hearing. And I decided to leave out the last sentence. Gave it to him the next day. Then the day after that, I get a note from Nelson Mandela.
At this point in the interview, Lord Joffe pulls out a scrapbook, a copy of all the documents he and his clients passed to one another during the trial. He turns to a page filled with Nelson Mandela's handwriting and shows me the record of the behind-the-scenes negotiations of that most memorable statement to the court.
And then he wrote here, "It is an ideal for which I've lived, and it is a deal for which I still hope to live." And so he realised, but if I... And then he crossed out the one concession he made. I'd taken out, "I'm afraid to die." He then said, but if needs be. And he said, no, I will say this, but by putting in "if needs be," at least he gave the judge the opportunity of not saying it's an invitation, an unqualified invitation. But it took a lot of effort on our part to even get him to make that modification.
Do you think that moment in the trial overall helped or hindered your case?
I think it proved to the world and to his followers that, as he put it, one must be prepared to give up one's life in order to achieve freedom for others. And that was a message which reverberated throughout South Africa. And I think it was a turning point in bringing Nelson Mandela to the attention of the world. You'll know from then on, he was always loved and revered beyond comparison.
The trial progressed, and Lord Joffe's scrapbook reveals more secrets of the preparations of the defence. He turns to the page containing an alternative version of history, the notes of the statement Nelson Mandela would have read in court if he'd been sentenced to death.
Nelson Mandela, as the other accused, all were calm. They weren't looking forward to the sentence because they thought that particularly Mandela, Walter Sisulu and Govan Mbeki and Dennis Goldberg, the four main accused, had every chance of being sentenced to death. These were the notes he'd prepared, which fortunately he never had to use. And he says, "I meant everything I said." And then he goes on to say the blood of many patriots in this country have been shed for democracy. And ends up, if I must die, let me declare for all to know that I will meet my fate like a man. There was no apologies.
That's nonetheless remarkable to see the scrapbook of what would have happened if things had turned out differently.
In his handwriting, it is a remarkable piece to have these papers, which I eventually donated back to South Africa. I sort of smuggled them out from South Africa when I left and kept them here until Mandela was president.
Having been found guilty, the day of sentencing had arrived, with crowds of Mandela's supporters outside court. Inside, far quieter but no less tense, and with the judge's words being recorded by the South African government, Lord Joffe sets the scene.
The court itself was packed with white and black spectators in their separate apartheid enclosures. And the accused were brought up and stood in the dock. The judge walked into the court. It was Justice de Wet, all resplendent in his judge's outfit. He's a very abrupt man, and he has very little to say, and he got up and he simply read from a piece of paper in front of him and said, "The accused have all been found guilty."
The crime of conspiracy is in essence one of high treason. The state has decided not to charge the crime in this form. Bearing this in mind and giving the matter very serious consideration, I have decided not to impose the supreme penalty.
And they are all sentenced to life imprisonment. And then he stood up and shot out, and they were then shuffled down to the cells again.
There's not many circumstances where a life sentence is seen as good news, but that was one of them.
Exactly. That's right. We thought a great triumph. You've got your clients a life sentence. But it was a triumph to save their lives.
With that in mind, you and your legal team are clearly credited with putting that case forward in such a way that it brought it down from the death penalty to a life sentence. Nonetheless, they spent decades behind bars. Yeah, Nelson Mandela spent 27 years behind bars. Was, looking back, there anything that you could have done differently, you feel, or that Were there any mistakes that you see it that perhaps it could have been even better than that, the result, or was this the best you could have hoped for?
When your clients effectively admit what they've done and admit that most of the charges against them, you couldn't do better than we did. It was actually a brilliant legal team. We had 4 of the outstanding barristers in South Africa, and they weren't just handling another trial. It was the most important trial of all our lives. And when I say 4 brilliant lawyers, it doesn't include me. I was another one. Another lawyer.
I think it's fair to say you can take some credit.
I think I probably, I think I did reasonably well.
The sentencing was followed by the world's media. One of the reporters, the BBC's Robin Day.
A remarkable demonstration by a crowd of several hundred outside the courthouse in Pretoria, the courthouse in which Mr. Justice de Vet delivered verdict and sentence in the sabotage trial, which had lasted 86 days.
Lord Joffe remembers that image well.
What was remarkable about the non-white people who were fighting for freedom was their courage and how they were prepared to confront armed policemen. And the way the unifying way of doing this was by their singing and their dancing. They would sing as they went along in groups and dance. I mean, Africans have got a wonderful sense of rhythm. And they would sing the freedom songs and the Khosi Sikeleli, the anthem. They created a sense of determination, courage, and fearlessness. They were not in any way intimidated, and it was inspirational to anyone who saw them confronting the police with their songs and their holding up signs, Free Mandela, and just showing total support for their leadership.
Nelson Mandela's wife stood with the crowd around her singing the African freedom song. After the sentences had been passed, I spoke to her alone.
I am slightly relieved. It could have been far worse than this. In fact, my people and I expected death sentences for all the accused. I shall never lose hope, and my people shall never lose hope.
The legal team were allowed one more meeting with their clients who'd been taken to the now infamous prison on Robben Island. They were planning to discuss the options for appeal, but in an act of solidarity, each defendant agreed they'd not challenge the sentence. That was 1964, and the last time Lord Joffe would see Nelson Mandela for decades. With nothing else to keep him in South Africa, he and his family fulfilled their plans to emigrate, leaving for Britain, and by the 1970s ending up here in Liddington, just outside Swindon. Today, on the wall of his office, hangs what appears a fairly ordinary picture frame. Inside it, though, a precious keepsake of that time. A letter Nelson Mandela had personally written to Lord Joffe during the trial.
I wouldn't say I was a friend of Mandela. I was an admirer of Mandela with enormous respect. But he does say this, actually. He says, "Today we know him both as a lawyer and a friend and have the highest regard for him in both capacities." And then he goes on to say, as a friend, Joel has taken on himself services far beyond the call of a lawyer's duty, and goes on. You know, people, when they give you sort of references, they always say nice things about you, but he says I was his friend. And of course, I'd be enormously proud to have been his friend.
And so the sentence on Robben Island began, and Lord Joffe ends up settling into a new life in Wiltshire with his family, unsure of whether he'd ever see Nelson Mandela again. But the 11th of February 1990 brought with it potential for a reunion.
After 27 years in South African jails, Nelson Mandela is a free man.
After more than a third of his life behind bars, his wife Winnie at his side, the world's first sight of a man considered so dangerous by South Africa's previous white rulers, he was kept hidden, unphotographed for over 25 years.
I greet you all in the name of peace, democracy and freedom for all. The majority of South Africans black and white, recognize that apartheid has no future.
We were glued to our television sets in England, over here at Liddington. But it took him a long, long time to emerge from prison and everybody who was waiting and watching would have seen that. He was an hour or two behind schedule. And then he came out and with Winnie, and Winnie is most beautiful, stunningly beautiful women, and the two of them looked like the perfect presidential couple you could have. And they came out of jail holding hands, as I think I recall, or working close to each other. And of course, it was a moment one could never forget, because he'd been, the last time I'd seen him was 27 years before.
A new era began. We leave Lord Joffe's office with its scrapbook of legal documents, the personal letter and the artwork depicting Nelson Mandela, and we head out into a sunny Wiltshire afternoon. The enclosed garden in a picturesque Wiltshire village nestled beneath the Ridgeway. It's a very different world from the one he left behind in South Africa. I asked him to describe his relationship with Mandela after his release.
He was the most popular and revered statesman in the world. So there was no relationship between us at all. I was a minor lawyer who was living in England. But I did meet him a number of times during this period. And the one must have been about 3 years ago. On a weekend, I came into his sitting room, and he was sitting reading a newspaper. And his already then was quite frail. And when he saw me, he got to get up, but I saw he was struggling. So I said, Mandela, that's what his clan name, please don't get up. And then he, with his mischievous face, says, for a peer of the land, I will always stand up. And he struggles to his feet. And this is the president to every world statesman, and everyone else is so keen to meet. And then nobody comes in, and he insists on getting up. But that's Nelson Mandela. And as he would always, when he would see me, when he was addressing a group and I happened to be there, he would say, loud, he would say, I see Joel Joffe over there. The man who sent me to jail for 27 years. and some of the people hearing it thought he was serious. But he always had this lovely sense of humour. Yes, I was astonished that anybody treated the way he was and the way his people could be willing to forgive. He realised that the only way of avoiding a bloody revolution in South Africa was to bring people together. And as he put it to me one day, as it happened, sometime after he was released, he entertained this prosecutor who had done his very best to humiliate him. He entertained him at the presidency.
And this is the man that earlier on you described as one of the most unpleasant men you'd ever encountered.
And who had really gone out of his way to humiliate Nelson Mandela and each of the accused, and behaved appallingly during the trial. Mandela invited him to the presidency for tea. When they came out after that together, and there were journalists in a media interview, and one of the journalists asked, how did Nelson Mandela feel about the way the trial had been conducted? And he said, well, Dr. Utah, that was the name, was doing his duty. Subsequently, I one day was at a dinner with Nelson Mandela and said, how could he possibly have said that Utah had behaved properly as a prosecutor? His response was almost immediate. He said, you know, Joel, he says, when you're trying to bring about reconciliation, you can never have the luxury of personal revenge. He's the greatest person I've ever met. He's an inspiration of whom one has just boundless admiration, respect and affection.